Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a coastline wrapped in cold gray mist. A place where the sea and the sky seem to merge into a single endless horizon, where the sound of waves crashing against stone has echoed for thousands of years, and where, on a summer morning in the year 793, a group of monks begins a day that seems no different from any other. They wake before dawn, as they always do. They walk through narrow corridors worn smooth by generations of footsteps. They light candles. They pray. They read sacred texts. They tend to their duties in quiet devotion. For them, the world makes sense. Kings rule by God's will. The church stands at the center of life. The sea protects them from distant dangers. And the monastery of Lindisfarne, standing on its small island off the northeastern coast of England, feels eternal. Its stone walls have survived storms. Its treasures have been gathered across generations. Its scribes have produced manuscripts so beautiful that people will still marvel at them more than 1,000 years later. Everything feels secure. Everything feels permanent. But far beyond the horizon, beyond the gray waters of the North Sea, another world exists. A colder world. A harsher world. A world shaped by mountains, forests, ice, and hunger. A world where survival is never guaranteed. A world that has been quietly preparing for its entrance onto the stage of history. And on this particular morning, that world is coming south. Long before anyone in England sees the ships, before monks hear the first cries, before the first sword is raised, the story has already begun hundreds of miles away in the rugged lands of Scandinavia. Because no civilization appears suddenly. No people emerge from nowhere. The Vikings did not burst into history fully formed. They were shaped by centuries of struggle, by geography, by climate, by opportunity, and by necessity. To understand why the Viking Age began, we must first understand the land that created the Vikings themselves. Scandinavia was unlike most of Europe. Even today it feels vast, wild, untamed. In the early medieval period it felt even more remote. The Scandinavian peninsula stretched across enormous distances. To the north lay regions where winter darkness lingered for months. Places where the sun barely climbed above the horizon. Places where cold winds swept across frozen landscapes with terrifying force. And then came summer, a season so different it must have felt almost magical. The sun remained visible for nearly 24 hours. Darkness faded. Life exploded across the landscape. Plants grew rapidly. Animals migrated. People worked relentlessly to prepare for the next long winter. Everything in Scandinavia revolved around nature's extremes. There was no escaping them. Norway's coastline was perhaps the most dramatic. Massive mountains rose directly from the sea. Deep fjords carved by ancient glaciers cut far inland. Some stretched for dozens of miles. These fjords created natural harbors unlike any found elsewhere in Europe. Protected waters, safe anchorages, perfect launching points for voyages. At the time, nobody knew just how important those fjords would become. Sweden offered a different landscape. Dense forests stretched seemingly without end. Pine, birch, spruce. Lakes dotted the countryside in astonishing numbers. Rivers wound through wilderness areas connecting distant settlements. These waterways would eventually become highways, carrying traders and adventurers deep into Eastern Europe. Long before roads existed, rivers served as pathways linking entire worlds together. Denmark was different again. Flatter, warmer, more suitable for agriculture. Compared with Norway's mountains and Sweden's forests, Denmark possessed advantages that would later help it become one of the most powerful centers of Viking activity. Yet despite these differences, all of Scandinavia shared one reality. Life was difficult. Modern people often imagine the past as simpler. In truth, survival demanded constant effort. A bad harvest could mean famine. An unusually harsh winter could wipe out livestock. Disease could destroy a family. There were no safety nets, no emergency services, no government relief. Nature made the rules. People adapted or they died. Most Scandinavians lived on farms scattered across valleys, coastlines, and forest clearings. Communities were small. Many consisted of only a handful of families. The center of daily life was the longhouse. These structures served many purposes at once. They were homes, workplaces, storage buildings, gathering halls, sometimes even shelters for animals. A single longhouse might contain multiple generations living beneath one roof. Grandparents, parents, children, servants, slaves, everyone sharing the same space. During winter, livestock might be brought indoors as well. The warmth they produced could make the difference between life and death. Inside these buildings, smoke from central hearths drifted upward through roof openings. The air was often thick, dark, filled with the smells of cooking, animals, damp wool, and burning wood. It was not comfortable by modern standards, but it was home, and home meant survival. Food reflected the environment. Nothing was wasted. Everything had value. Barley and oats formed the foundation of many meals. Porridge appeared frequently. Flatbreads were common. Fish played a vital role along the coasts. Cod, herring, salmon. Countless species provided protein throughout the year. Preservation was essential. Fish were dried, smoked, salted whenever possible. The goal was simple: store enough food to survive winter. Because winter always returned, inland communities relied more heavily on hunting. Deer, elk, wild boar, small game. Anything edible mattered. Berries gathered during summer provided precious nutrients. Nuts supplemented diets. Every season brought specific opportunities. Every season demanded hard work. Children worked. Adults worked. The elderly worked as long as they could. Life allowed few idle moments. Yet despite these hardships, Scandinavia was not some bleak wasteland. People laughed, celebrated, fell in love, raised families, told stories, played games, created art, and developed rich spiritual traditions. Before Christianity reached the north, religious belief centered around the natural world. Forests felt alive. Mountains felt alive. Rivers felt alive. Spirits existed everywhere. Sacred places emerged not because buildings were constructed there, but because people believed supernatural forces already inhabited them. Certain groves became holy. Particular springs attracted offerings. Large stones inspired reverence. The boundary between the human world and the unseen world felt thin. People sought protection, good harvests, healthy children, safe journeys. They offered gifts to unseen powers in hopes of receiving blessings in return. Death held special significance. The dead were rarely treated as gone forever. Instead, death marked another stage of existence. Burials often included tools, weapons, jewelry, personal possessions. The living believed these items might be needed beyond the grave. This belief would eventually develop into the famous burial customs associated with the Viking Age. Even in these early centuries, the seeds of later Viking culture were already present. Honor mattered. Reputation mattered. Family mattered. Survival depended on cooperation, but it also depended on strength. Communities respected courage. They respected skill. They respected those capable of protecting others. These values would become central to Viking identity. Trade connected Scandinavia to the wider world long before Viking raids began. Amber traveled south. Furs moved through distant markets. Iron tools arrived from other regions. Glass beads appeared in northern settlements. Luxury goods occasionally reached wealthy families. The connections existed, but they remained limited. Most people never traveled far from where they were born. The world beyond neighboring valleys remained mysterious. Yet change was coming. Slowly at first, almost invisibly, population increased, communities expanded, competition for resources intensified, political structures evolved, new technologies emerged, and among those technologies, one would prove more important than any other: the ship. Humans had traveled by water in Scandinavia for thousands of years. Fishing required boats. Trade required boats. Travel often depended on waterways. But over generations, Scandinavian shipbuilders achieved something extraordinary. They refined techniques that transformed simple boats into vessels capable of crossing oceans. The process was gradual. No single inventor created the Viking ship. No single breakthrough changed everything overnight. Instead, countless craftsmen improved designs little by little, year after year, generation after generation, until eventually they produced some of the most remarkable ships the world had ever seen. The secret lay partly in construction. Shipbuilders developed what historians call clinker building. Wooden planks overlapped each other. Iron rivets secured them together. The resulting hull possessed unusual flexibility. Instead of resisting waves rigidly, it moved with them. The ship bent, flexed, absorbed stress. This made it astonishingly resilient in rough seas. And rough seas were exactly what northern sailors faced. Every component required skill. Trees were carefully selected. Wood was split rather than sawn. This preserved natural grain patterns and increased strength. Keels were carved from massive trunks. Planks were shaped with extraordinary precision. There was little margin for error. Mistakes could cost lives. By the 8th century, Scandinavian shipbuilders had achieved something remarkable. Their vessels combined speed, durability, and versatility. They could navigate open oceans. They could travel along coastlines. They could move up rivers. They could be dragged short distances across land if necessary. Few other ships in Europe offered such flexibility. The famous longship emerged from this tradition. Long, narrow, fussed, beautiful, terrifying, powered by sail and oars, capable of carrying warriors across enormous distances, capable of appearing suddenly where nobody expected them. The shallow draft proved especially important. These ships required very little water. They could sail far inland through rivers. They could land directly on beaches. No harbor was necessary. No dock required. Where water existed, Vikings could go. The dragon heads mounted on many prows added another dimension. They served practical and symbolic purposes. Enemies saw them and felt fear. Crew members saw them and felt pride. Some believed they offered supernatural protection. Others saw them as declarations of power. Either way, they became iconic. But ships alone do not create history. People must decide to use them. And the people of Scandinavia were beginning to look outward. Pressure mounted inside their homeland. Land was limited. Ambitious young men sought opportunities. Political rivalries created winners and losers. Some individuals accumulated wealth and influence. Others found themselves excluded. Across the sea, opportunities seemed endless. Monasteries held treasure. Kingdoms possessed wealth. Trade routes promised profits. And unlike later generations, Europeans at the time rarely expected attacks from the ocean. The sea still felt like a barrier. A shield, protection. Few understood it could also function as a highway. The Scandinavians understood. Their ships taught them. Their environment taught them. Their experience taught them. Gradually, voyages became longer. Crews became bolder. Stories spread. A successful expedition returned with silver. Another returned with valuable goods. Another brought tales of vulnerable targets waiting beyond the horizon. Each voyage inspired more. Each success encouraged greater risks. Then came the year 793, a date that would echo through history. A date remembered not because it marked the first Viking voyage, not because it marked the first Scandinavian attack, but because the event that occurred that year shocked the Christian world in a way few events ever had. Far from Scandinavia, on the island monastery of Lindisfarne, monks followed familiar routines. They prayed, worked, read, worshipped. They had no idea that sails had already appeared on the horizon. No idea that dragon-prowed ships were moving steadily toward shore. No idea that they were about to become part of one of the most famous moments in medieval history. And as those ships drew closer through the cold morning mist, Europe stood on the edge of a new age. An age of exploration, trade, conquest, violence, adventure. An age that would forever be remembered as the Age of the Vikings. The ships came out of the mist like creatures from another world. Long, low, moving with unsettling speed across the gray waters. For the monks of Lindisfarne, there was no reason to expect what was about to happen. Generations had lived and worshipped here. The monastery stood as one of the most important religious centers in Britain. It was a place of learning, a place of prayer, a place where sacred texts were copied by hand and preserved for future generations. The island's isolation had always seemed like a blessing. Now it would become a curse. The approaching vessels carried men who had grown up in a completely different world. Men hardened by harsh climates. Men accustomed to risk. Men who saw opportunity where others saw danger. As the ships scraped against the shore and warriors leapt into the shallows, the Viking Age truly announced itself to Europe. The attack itself was swift, brutal, and deeply shocking. The raiders moved through the monastery searching for valuables. Gold, silver, precious objects, anything that could be carried away. Sacred relics meant nothing to them. Holy places offered no protection. The monastery's treasures represented wealth. Nothing more. Some monks were killed. Others were captured. Buildings were damaged. Valuable possessions vanished. Within hours, the attackers were gone. The ships disappeared back across the sea, leaving confusion behind them. And fear. A great deal of fear. The physical damage mattered, but the psychological impact mattered even more. For centuries, many people in Christian Europe had viewed monasteries as places protected by divine favor. If such a sacred location could be attacked, if such a respected institution could be violated, then what place was truly safe? News spread rapidly. Messengers carried reports across kingdoms. Church leaders reacted with horror. Writers described the event in emotional language rarely found in medieval records. To many observers, the attack seemed almost apocalyptic. Some interpreted it as divine punishment. Others saw it as a sign of approaching catastrophe. Few realized they were witnessing the beginning of nearly 3 centuries of Viking expansion. The men who attacked Lindisfarne almost certainly did not think of themselves as participants in some grand historical movement. They were seeking wealth, status, opportunity. Their goals were immediate, practical, yet their actions changed history. And perhaps most importantly, they succeeded. They returned home carrying treasure. They returned home carrying stories. They proved something critical. The wealthy lands across the sea were vulnerable, very vulnerable. Word spread through Scandinavia. Other crews listened. Other leaders paid attention. If one expedition could achieve so much, why not another? Why not 10 more? Why not 100? The years following Lindisfarne saw exactly that pattern unfold. More ships appeared. More coastal communities were attacked. Monasteries became frequent targets. Not because Vikings hated Christianity in any organized sense, but because monasteries possessed valuable objects and lacked strong defenses. From the Viking perspective, they were logical targets. Rich, exposed, accessible. Ireland experienced raids. Scotland experienced raids. England experienced raids. Soon the coastlines of Western Europe learned to fear unfamiliar sails appearing on the horizon. The attacks followed a recognizable pattern. Speed was everything. Surprise was everything. Viking crews arrived suddenly, struck hard, gathered what they could, and departed before local rulers could organize effective resistance. Traditional defenses struggled against such tactics. Castles were rare. Standing armies barely existed. Most kingdoms relied on raising forces when danger appeared. But Viking raiders often vanished before defenders arrived. The sea protected the attackers. It gave them mobility unlike anything most Europeans had encountered. It would be a mistake to imagine every Viking expedition as a blood-soaked campaign. The reality was more complicated. Some voyages focused primarily on trade. Others combined trading and raiding. Many Vikings displayed extraordinary pragmatism. If peaceful exchange offered greater profits than violence, they traded. If violence promised greater rewards, they fought. There was no contradiction in their minds. Opportunity mattered more than ideology. As the decades passed, Viking activity expanded dramatically. New generations grew up hearing stories about successful voyages. Young men saw returning raiders displaying wealth that few farmers could ever hope to acquire. Silver arm rings, fine weapons, foreign goods, prestige, status, adventure. The attraction was obvious. Participation in overseas expeditions offered possibilities unavailable at home. Not everyone joined. Most Scandinavians remained farmers throughout their lives, but enough joined to transform northern society. Shipbuilding accelerated. Weapons production increased. Trade networks expanded. Entire communities became connected to overseas ventures. And with each passing year, Viking crews pushed farther from home. Some sailed south toward the Frankish kingdoms. Others moved west into the Atlantic. Still others explored river systems leading deep into Eastern Europe. The Viking world was expanding rapidly. At the center of this expansion stood the warrior. Few historical figures have captured popular imagination as strongly as the Viking warrior. Images of fierce fighters armed with axes and swords dominate modern perceptions. Yet the reality deserves closer examination. Contrary to many modern depictions, the typical Viking warrior was not a full-time soldier. Most were farmers first, fighters second. Their daily lives involved agriculture, fishing, craft work, family responsibilities. Military service occurred when opportunities or obligations arose. This distinction matters. Viking society lacked large professional armies during much of the period. Instead, communities expected free men to defend themselves and participate in military expeditions. Training began early. Boys learned practical skills from childhood. They handled tools, worked outdoors, developed physical strength. Many also learned how to use weapons. Combat ability carried social value. A man incapable of defending himself risked losing respect. Weapons themselves reflected status differences. The sword occupied a special position. Beautiful, expensive, prestigious. A high-quality sword represented a significant investment. Crafting one required exceptional skill. Metal workers carefully combined different types of iron and steel. The goal was creating blades both strong and flexible. Such weapons often became family heirlooms, passed from one generation to another. Named, remembered, celebrated in stories. But swords remained beyond the reach of many people. Axes proved far more common. Modern audiences sometimes imagine Viking axes as crude tools repurposed for battle. In reality, many were specifically designed weapons. Light enough for speed, powerful enough to inflict devastating injuries, versatile enough for different fighting styles. An experienced warrior could use an axe with frightening effectiveness. Spears also appeared frequently. Simple, affordable, deadly. They could be thrown before combat began. They could be used in close fighting. Many warriors carried them. The spear may actually have been more common than the sword despite receiving less attention in modern culture. Protection mattered too. The shield became one of the defining features of Viking warfare. Round, wooden, often brightly painted, far from primitive. A well-made shield could absorb tremendous punishment. And when warriors stood side by side with overlapping shields, they created formations capable of resisting powerful attacks. The shield wall became one of the most important tactical tools of the era. Success depended on discipline, courage, coordination. Individual heroics mattered less than collective strength. As long as the wall held, survival chances improved dramatically. Armor existed, but it was expensive. Chainmail required enormous labor. Thousands of metal rings had to be forged and linked together. Only wealthier warriors could afford such protection. Most fought wearing ordinary clothing, reinforced perhaps by leather garments. Helmets were more common than full-body armor. Yet even helmets were far from universal. One of the most persistent myths surrounding Vikings concerns horns. The famous horned helmet appears constantly in movies and illustrations. Unfortunately, it has almost no basis in Viking reality. Actual Viking helmets discovered by archaeologists are practical military equipment. Simple, functional, designed for protection. Horns would have created serious disadvantages during combat. They would have provided opponents with convenient handholds. The image survives because 19th century artists found it dramatic, not because Vikings actually wore such helmets in battle. Combat itself was intensely personal. Fighting occurred at close range, face to face, shield against shield, weapon against weapon. The experience must have been terrifying. Noise filled the air. Metal struck wood. Men shouted. Wounded warriors screamed. Victory often depended on maintaining courage while chaos erupted around you. Viking culture admired bravery intensely. Stories celebrated individuals who remained calm under pressure, who fought despite injuries, who refused to flee. Whether these stories always reflected reality is another question, but they reveal what society valued. Honor stood near the center of Viking life. Modern audiences sometimes struggle to understand just how important reputation could be. A person's standing within the community affected everything. Marriage prospects, political influence, alliances, economic opportunities. Honor was social currency. Losing it could be disastrous. Protecting it became essential. This emphasis shaped behavior. Insults mattered. Promises mattered. Acts of courage mattered. Acts of cowardice mattered even more. People lived within networks of relationships where reputation influenced survival itself. The famous berserkers emerged from this cultural environment. Few figures inspire more fascination. According to historical sources, berserkers entered battle in states of extraordinary fury. They appeared fearless, uncontrollable, almost superhuman. Stories describe them roaring like animals, ignoring wounds, attacking with terrifying aggression. Modern historians continue debating the truth behind these accounts. Some suggest psychological conditioning. Others propose ritual practices. Some believe later writers exaggerated dramatically. The exact reality remains uncertain. What is clear is that berserkers occupied a special place within Viking imagination. They represented warrior ferocity taken to its extreme, and their reputation alone may have frightened opponents. As Viking activity intensified, European rulers gradually adapted. Defenses improved. Coastal communities became more cautious. Warning systems developed. But adaptation took time. And during that time, the Vikings continued growing stronger. Their ambitions expanded. Their confidence increased. Raiding evolved. What began as relatively small expeditions would eventually transform into something much larger. Because successful raids create wealth. Wealth creates power. Power creates ambition. And ambition rarely remains satisfied for long. The first generations of Viking raiders generally sought treasure. The next generations began seeking territory. Instead of merely visiting foreign lands, some Vikings started imagining permanent settlements. Instead of taking wealth and leaving, they considered staying. Farming, trading, building communities, creating new lives. This shift would change everything. The Viking Age was about to enter a new phase. A phase defined not simply by raids, but by conquest. And nowhere would that transformation become more dramatic than in England. Because in the middle of the 9th century, a force unlike anything Britain had previously encountered was preparing to cross the sea. Not a handful of ships, not a seasonal raiding party, but an army. A force large enough to challenge kingdoms. A force determined not merely to steal wealth, but to claim land. For nearly 70 years after the attack on Lindisfarne, Viking raids remained a familiar terror across the coasts of Britain and Ireland. Ships appeared, settlements burned, treasure disappeared. Then the raiders vanished back across the sea. The pattern repeated so often that entire communities learned to live with uncertainty. Every sail on the horizon became a cause for concern. Every rumor sparked fear. Yet despite the damage these attacks caused, they were still fundamentally temporary. The Vikings came, and then they left. That distinction mattered, because in the year 865, something different arrived, something far more dangerous. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would later call it the Great Heathen Army. The name itself reflected the shock it inspired. This was not a raiding party. This was not a handful of ambitious adventurers. This was an invasion. Across the North Sea came a force unlike anything Britain had previously experienced from Scandinavia. Thousands of warriors, experienced leaders, organized planning, clear objectives, and perhaps most importantly, the determination to remain. The exact size of the army remains debated. Medieval writers often exaggerated numbers. Modern historians continue arguing overestimates. But regardless of the precise figure, the force was large enough to overwhelm kingdoms that had previously survived generations of raids. For the people of England, the difference became immediately obvious. These Vikings were not simply looking for portable wealth. They wanted control, land, power, influence. Their arrival marked a turning point in British history. Legend connected the army's leadership to one of the most famous names in Viking tradition, Ragnar Lothbrok. Whether Ragnar existed exactly as later stories described remains uncertain. His life sits somewhere between history and legend, yet the men associated with him were very real. Among them are figures whose names still echo through history. Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Ubba, war leaders whose campaigns would transform the British Isles. The army landed in East Anglia. Immediately local rulers faced a difficult choice: fight or negotiate. The East Anglians chose a practical approach. They provided horses and supplies. The Vikings accepted. This decision bought temporary peace, but it also strengthened the invaders. Mounted warriors could move rapidly, cover vast distances, strike unexpectedly. The army's mobility increased dramatically. Soon the Vikings moved north. Their target was Northumbria, and Northumbria offered an opportunity too tempting to ignore. The kingdom was divided by internal conflict. Rival claimants struggled for power. Political instability weakened resistance. The Vikings exploited these divisions with ruthless efficiency. In 866, they captured York, one of the most important cities in England. The loss sent shockwaves through the region. York was more than a city. It was a symbol of power, a center of trade, a political heart. Its capture demonstrated that no kingdom was safe. The Northumbrians attempted to recover. Rival factions briefly united. Armies assembled. A counterattack followed, but the effort failed. The Vikings defeated them. Both rival kings died. Northumbria collapsed as an independent power within a remarkably short period. One of England's major kingdoms had effectively ceased to exist. For the invaders, the victory provided more than territory. It provided confidence, momentum, proof that conquest was possible. The army pushed onward. Next came Mercia, powerful, influential, strategically important. Yet Mercia struggled to resist the growing Scandinavian threat. Campaigns stretched across years. Battles occurred. Negotiations followed. Kings rose and fell. Eventually, Viking influence spread across much of the kingdom. What had once seemed impossible was becoming reality. One kingdom after another bent beneath the pressure. By the late 870s, only one major Anglo-Saxon kingdom remained truly independent: Wessex. And in Wessex stood a leader who would become one of the most important figures in English history: Alfred. At first glance, Alfred did not seem destined to save the kingdom. His situation looked bleak. The Vikings appeared unstoppable. Their victories accumulated. Their confidence grew. Many observers likely assumed Wessex would eventually fall like the others. Indeed, there were moments when collapse seemed almost inevitable. The struggle tested Alfred repeatedly. Defeats occurred. Retreats became necessary. At one point, circumstances deteriorated so severely that Alfred found himself hiding within the marshlands of Somerset. His enemies controlled large portions of his kingdom. His resources were limited. His future uncertain. Later generations would transform this period into legend. Stories emerged. Some true, some exaggerated. One famous tale claimed Alfred accidentally burned cakes while hiding in a peasant woman's home. Whether factual or not, the story survived because it portrayed a king enduring hardship alongside ordinary people. Yet behind the legends stood a remarkable reality. Alfred refused to surrender. He adapted. He learned. He observed Viking methods carefully. Many rulers confronted by the Vikings made the mistake of fighting old wars against a new enemy. Alfred understood something important. To survive, Wessex had to change. Military reforms followed. Defensive systems improved. Fortified settlements, known as bays, appeared across the kingdom. These strongholds created networks of protection. Communities gained places of refuge. Communication improved. Response times accelerated. Instead of relying solely on field armies, Alfred built a defensive infrastructure. At the same time, he reorganized military service. Troops rotated responsibilities. Some remained available for defense, while others managed farms and daily obligations. The system increased flexibility. It allowed resistance to continue over long periods. And eventually, the strategy paid off. The decisive moment arrived in 878. After years of conflict, Alfred gathered his forces. He emerged from the marshes. He called his supporters together, and he marched toward confrontation. The two sides met at Edington. The battle that followed would help determine the future of England. Details remain limited. Medieval accounts rarely provide the tactical precision modern historians desire. Yet the outcome is clear. Alfred won. The Vikings were defeated. They retreated. Alfred pursued. A siege followed. The invaders found themselves trapped. Supplies dwindled. Options disappeared. Eventually, surrender became unavoidable. What happened next remains one of the most fascinating moments in the entire Viking Age. Alfred possessed choices. He could execute prisoners, demand total submission, pursue endless revenge. Instead, he chose a different path: negotiation, compromise, pragmatism. The Viking leader Guthrum accepted baptism. Christianity became part of the settlement. Agreements established boundaries. Peace emerged from exhaustion. The resulting arrangement created something extraordinary. A region known as the Danelaw. Across much of northern and eastern England, Scandinavian influence became dominant. Vikings settled permanently. Families arrived. Farms appeared. Communities expanded. The age of temporary raids gave way to long-term colonization. This transformation altered England forever. The newcomers brought language, customs, laws, agricultural practices, trade networks, and over time, they blended with local populations. The process was neither simple nor immediate. Conflicts continued, differences remained, yet interaction produced cultural exchange on a massive scale. Today, traces survive everywhere. Place names reveal the past. Towns ending in words such as by often indicate Viking origins. Languages mixed, ideas merged, families intermarried. The descendants of Scandinavians and Anglo-Saxons built shared communities. The story of the Danelaw challenges simplistic ideas about Vikings. These people were not merely destroyers. They were settlers, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, parents raising children, individuals creating homes far from Scandinavia. Many who arrived as invaders eventually became residents. Their identities evolved. The same man who carried a sword might also plow fields, raise livestock, attend legal assemblies, participate in local trade. History rarely fits neat categories. The Vikings demonstrate this perfectly. Even as settlements expanded, warfare remained central to their world. Honor still mattered. Status still mattered. Leadership still mattered. Success brought rewards. Failure carried consequences. Viking society revolved around relationships between leaders and followers. Powerful individuals attracted support by distributing wealth. Successful leaders rewarded loyalty. Followers expected gifts, protection, opportunities. These bonds helped explain how large expeditions formed. A respected leader could gather warriors from multiple communities. Shared ambition created shared action. Yet loyalty required maintenance. A leader who failed repeatedly risked losing followers. Prestige had to be earned continuously. The social system encouraged boldness. It encouraged risk-taking. And sometimes it encouraged extraordinary acts of courage. Stories from the period reveal a culture obsessed with reputation. Men sought fame because fame outlasted death. A person's actions became stories. Stories became memory. Memory became legacy. This idea appears repeatedly throughout Norse literature. Life was temporary. Glory could endure. Such beliefs influenced behavior in profound ways. A warrior entering battle understood mortality. Death was familiar. Disease killed. Accidents killed. Famine killed. Violence killed. The question was not whether death would come. The question was how one would face it. That mindset helps explain why courage occupied such an important place within Viking culture. But courage alone never guaranteed success. Practicality mattered just as much. The Vikings survived and expanded because they combined bravery with adaptability. They learned from enemies, adopted useful techniques, adjusted strategies when circumstances changed. Their greatest strength was not savagery. It was flexibility. This flexibility would soon carry them beyond England, far beyond, across Ireland, across Scotland, across vast river systems stretching deep into Eastern Europe, across oceans toward Iceland and Greenland. The Viking world was growing larger with every passing decade. And while England fought for survival against Scandinavian armies, other Vikings were building entirely different futures elsewhere. Some would found cities. Some would create kingdoms. Some would establish trade routes linking distant civilizations. The story of the Vikings was becoming far bigger than raids and battles. It was becoming a story of transformation. And nowhere would that transformation be more visible than in Ireland, where Viking longships were already appearing along the coast, and where a small settlement beside a river was beginning its journey toward becoming one of the most important cities in the North Atlantic world. While armies fought across England, another story was unfolding across the waters of the Irish Sea. It began in much the same way. A few ships, A few raids, a few startled communities watching unfamiliar sails emerge from the horizon. At first, the people of Ireland likely viewed these attacks as temporary disasters, terrible events to be endured, no different from other dangers that periodically struck medieval societies. But the Vikings had no intention of remaining temporary visitors. What started as raiding would eventually become settlement, trade, political influence, and lasting cultural change. The first recorded Viking attacks on Ireland occurred near the end of the 8th century, only a short time after Lindisfarne. Monasteries along the coast quickly attracted attention. Like their counterparts in Britain, Irish monasteries often possessed wealth. They stored valuable religious objects, collected tribute, maintained supplies, and generally lacked strong military protection. To Viking crews searching for profit, they appeared irresistible. The attacks multiplied, year after year. Coastal communities adapted as best they could. Monks hid treasures. Some settlements moved farther inland. Others constructed defenses. Yet the Vikings continued appearing. Fussed, mobile, unpredictable. Ireland's political landscape complicated resistance. Unlike modern nations, Ireland was not a unified kingdom. Instead, it consisted of numerous competing rulers. Kings governed territories of varying size. Alliances shifted constantly. Rivalries endured for generations. The result was a political environment filled with opportunity, not only for Irish leaders, but for Vikings as well. One king might fight Scandinavian raiders one year, then hire Scandinavian mercenaries the next. Practicality often outweighed ideology. Power mattered. Survival mattered. Victory mattered. Who provided assistance was sometimes less important. The Vikings recognized this reality quickly. They learned local politics, exploited divisions, built relationships, and eventually established permanent footholds. Among those footholds, one would become especially significant: Dublin. Today it stands as the capital of Ireland, a modern European city with millions of visitors every year. But its origins are deeply connected to the Viking Age. Around the middle of the 9th century, Scandinavian settlers established a fortified base near the mouth of the River Liffey. The location offered advantages: access to inland waterways, connections to sea routes, opportunities for trade, defensive possibilities. What began as a strategic encampment gradually evolved into something much larger. A town, a port, a center of commerce, a gateway linking Ireland to the wider Viking world. The transformation was remarkable. Ships arrived carrying goods from distant regions. Merchants exchanged products from Scandinavia, Britain, continental Europe, and beyond. Craftsmen established workshops. Metalworkers created jewelry. Leatherworkers produced goods. Markets expanded. Wealth circulated. Dublin became one of the most important urban centers in the North Atlantic. And it was not alone. Other settlements emerged: Waterford, Wexford, Cork, Limerick. Many of Ireland's major coastal cities trace important parts of their development to Viking foundations. The newcomers did not remain isolated. Interaction with local populations occurred constantly. Trade encouraged cooperation. Shared interests encouraged partnerships. Intermarriage became common. Children grew up influenced by both Scandinavian and Irish traditions. Languages mixed. Customs blended. Identities evolved. Over time, it became increasingly difficult to draw clear lines between Viking and Irish. Reality proved far more complicated. Many Scandinavian settlers learned Gaelic. Many Irish families developed connections with Viking communities. Political alliances crossed cultural boundaries. The descendants of these relationships created entirely new social groups. People whose identities reflected multiple traditions simultaneously. Yet peace was never permanent. Conflict remained a constant possibility. Battles erupted. Kings competed. Territories changed hands. Ambitious leaders sought dominance. The Viking presence became woven into the fabric of Irish politics itself. No longer simply outsiders. They became participants, power brokers, rivals, allies. The impact extended beyond politics. The Vikings introduced new economic practices. Coinage became increasingly important. Trade networks expanded dramatically. Goods flowed across greater distances. Urban life developed in ways previously uncommon within Ireland. The effects would continue shaping the island for centuries. Scotland experienced similar transformations, but the Scottish story possessed its own unique character. The geography alone created different possibilities. Hundreds of islands stretched along the western and northern coasts. The Hebrides, Orkney, Shetland, the Isle of Man. These islands occupied strategic positions across maritime routes. For sailors navigating northern waters, they represented stepping stones between worlds. Norwegian Vikings recognized their value almost immediately. Settlement followed. In some places, Scandinavian influence became overwhelming. Entire communities adopted Norse languages, Norse customs, Norse political structures. Archaeological evidence reveals just how extensive the transformation could be. Farmsteads appeared. Burials reflected Scandinavian traditions. Place names changed. Generations grew up identifying strongly with Norse culture. Orkney became particularly important. Its location offered exceptional control over northern sea routes. Powerful local rulers emerged. The Earls of Orkney developed influence extending far beyond the islands themselves. They controlled trade, directed military expeditions, participated in the politics of multiple regions. Their authority linked Scotland, Norway, Ireland, and other parts of the Viking world. Yet mainland Scotland proved more difficult to dominate. Its kingdoms resisted. Its terrain complicated campaigns. Its leaders adapted. Conflict and cooperation existed side by side. Some Scottish rulers fought Vikings fiercely. Others negotiated. Still others entered alliances when circumstances demanded. The relationship constantly shifted. One of the most important consequences of Viking pressure may have been political unification. Faced with external threats, rival groups sometimes discovered common interests. Historians continue debating the details, but there is little doubt that Viking activity influenced the development of medieval Scotland. Challenges often create change. The Viking Age created many challenges. Across both Ireland and Scotland, the Scandinavian presence became permanent. Not because every settlement survived unchanged, not because conflict disappeared, but because communities rooted themselves in local landscapes. Children were born, families expanded, cultures merged. The Vikings were no longer merely visitors. They became part of the population itself. This pattern repeated throughout much of the Viking world. Conquest alone rarely explains long-term influence. Settlement does. Adaptation does. Integration does. The most enduring Viking legacies emerged not from battles, but from communities, from markets, from marriages, from generations of ordinary people building lives. While this process unfolded in the West, another branch of Viking expansion moved in an entirely different direction. East, toward lands very different from Britain or Ireland, toward enormous river systems stretching across forests and grasslands, toward civilizations wealthier than anything most Scandinavians had ever encountered, toward Constantinople, toward the Islamic world, toward silver, vast quantities of silver. The Eastern Vikings are often less famous than their Western counterparts. Popular imagination tend to focus on dragon ships attacking monasteries. Yet some of the most important Viking achievements occurred far from the Atlantic. Swedish adventurers and traders looked eastward, and what they found transformed Scandinavian society. The geography encouraged exploration. Large rivers connected the Baltic region to distant territories. The Volga, the Dnieper, countless tributaries. Together, they formed natural highways leading deep into the heart of Eastern Europe. Travel was difficult. Rapids interrupted routes. Ships sometimes had to be dragged across land. Portages required enormous effort. Weather created constant challenges. Hostile groups posed dangers. Yet the rewards proved extraordinary. The farther east Vikings traveled, the more they encountered worlds of astonishing wealth. Great cities, sophisticated governments, luxury goods, complex trade networks. For men raised in relatively small northern communities, the experience must have been breathtaking. Among the greatest prizes stood Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, one of the largest and richest cities on earth. Its walls towered above visitors. Its markets overflowed with goods. Its churches glittered with gold and mosaics. Compared to most settlements in Scandinavia, Constantinople seemed almost unimaginable. Vikings called it Miklagard, the great city. The name itself reflected admiration. Trade connected these worlds. Furs moved south, amber moved south, honey, wax, and tragically, slaves. Human beings became one of the most profitable commodities in the Eastern trade, captured during raids or warfare, sold through networks stretching across continents. The scale was enormous, and it formed a dark but important part of Viking economic success. In return, silver flowed north. Huge quantities of silver, Islamic coins minted thousands of miles away, eventually reached Scandinavian settlements. Archaeologists continue discovering them today, buried in fields, hidden in hoards, preserved as evidence of astonishing long-distance connections. The impact on Scandinavia was transformative. Silver funded further expeditions, supported growing elites, stimulated trade, encouraged urban development. Wealth generated in distant markets reshaped northern societies. Some Vikings went beyond trade. They established political control. Gradually, Scandinavian groups gained influence over local populations along key river routes. Settlements grew. Power expanded. Out of these developments emerged one of the most important states in Eastern European history, the realm known as the Rus. The origins of the Rus remain debated in detail, but Scandinavian involvement is undeniable. Norse leaders ruled populations composed largely of Slavic peoples. Over time, cultures blended, languages mixed, political systems evolved. The descendants of these communities helped shape the foundations of later Russian and Ukrainian history. The name Rus itself may derive from Scandinavian roots, a reminder of how deeply connected these stories became. Yet the process followed a familiar pattern. At first, the Vikings arrived as outsiders. Then they settled. Then they adapted. Eventually, many became almost indistinguishable from the populations around them. The same transformation visible in England, in Ireland, in Scotland, appeared again in the East. The Vikings changed the regions they entered, but those regions changed the Vikings as well. And as Scandinavian traders moved through Eastern Europe, some found employment in one of the most prestigious military units of the medieval world, the Varangian Guard, personal protectors of Byzantine emperors, elite warriors recruited from the north, men whose loyalty became legendary, serving beneath the golden domes of Constantinople, far from the fjords and forests of their ancestors. The Viking world had become truly enormous, from North America to the Middle East, from Arctic islands to imperial capitals. Scandinavians appeared in places their ancestors could scarcely have imagined. And yet, despite these vast distances, despite the wealth and opportunities, They carried something else with them wherever they went. Their beliefs, their stories, their gods. Because before Christianity transformed Scandinavia, the Vikings viewed the universe through a rich and powerful mythology. A world filled with gods, giants, monsters, prophecies, magic, and an ending that even the gods themselves could not escape. Long before churches rose across Scandinavia, long before kings carried Christian banners, long before missionaries arrived from the south, the people of the north understood the universe through stories. Not simple stories, not children's tales, but vast narratives that explained existence itself. Stories that gave meaning to storms, to war, to death, to courage, to fate. These stories shaped how Vikings saw the world. They influenced decisions, inspired warriors, comforted families, and helped people make sense of a harsh and unpredictable life. To understand the Vikings fully, it is not enough to study their ships or battles. We must step into their imagination. We must see the world as they saw it. A world alive with unseen forces. A world balanced between order and chaos. A world destined to end, and then begin again. At the center of this universe stood Yggdrasil, the great world tree, an immense ash tree whose roots and branches connected all existence. Everything lived within its shadow. Everything depended upon it. The gods, human beings, giants, creatures of light, creatures of darkness, the living, the dead, all were connected through the vast structure of Yggdrasil. To modern minds, this image may seem symbolic. To many Vikings, it was something deeper, a framework for understanding reality itself. Above existed Asgard, the realm of the gods, a place of power and wonder, a place where divine beings watched the world below. In another realm lay Midgard, the world of human beings, the familiar world of farms, forests, mountains, rivers, and seas. Beyond Midgard stretched dangerous territories inhabited by giants and other supernatural beings. Far below lay realms associated with death, cold, mist, and mystery. The universe was not peaceful. It was constantly threatened. Forces of order struggled endlessly against forces of chaos. The gods themselves fought to preserve balance. Yet they knew something terrifying. One day they would fail. Among all the gods, one stood above the others. Odin, the All-Father, ruler of Asgard, god of wisdom, Va, poetry, magic, and death. But Odin was not a comforting figure. He was not a gentle protector. He was complex, brilliant, dangerous, relentless in his pursuit of knowledge. According to legend, Odin sacrificed one of his eyes in exchange for wisdom. He willingly accepted physical loss to gain deeper understanding. The story reveals something important about Viking values. Knowledge possessed power, and power often required sacrifice. Odin's search for wisdom never ended. He wandered, questioned, observed, manipulated. He sought information wherever it could be found, even if the price proved painful. Warriors respected Odin. Many hoped to earn his favor, yet they also understood his unpredictable nature. He granted victory, but he could also take it away. He rewarded courage, yet he might still choose a brave warrior for death. His motives remained mysterious. His plans extended beyond human understanding. If Odin represented wisdom and strategy, Thor represented strength. Raw, direct, overwhelming strength. Thor became one of the most beloved gods in the Viking world. His popularity extended across social classes. Farmers admired him. Sailors admired him. Warriors admired him. Ordinary people often felt closer to Thor than to the distant and enigmatic Odin. Thor wielded Mjolnir, his legendary hammer, one of the most famous weapons in mythology. The hammer symbolized protection, power, and stability. Thor fought giants, destroyed monsters, defended both gods and humans from chaos. Unlike Odin's complexity, Thor seemed straightforward, honest, reliable, courageous, the kind of figure people trusted during uncertain times. His symbols appeared everywhere. Amulets shaped like hammers have been discovered throughout Scandinavia. Many were worn around the neck, perhaps for protection, perhaps for identity, perhaps for both. Other gods occupied important roles as well. Freya stood among the most significant, a goddess associated with love, beauty, fertility, magic, and war. Her influence extended across many aspects of life. She represented desire and power simultaneously. According to tradition, some warriors who died in battle joined her in the afterlife. Not all fallen fighters belonged exclusively to Odin. Freya claimed her share as well. Her importance reminds us that Viking religion extended far beyond warfare. It addressed family, relationships, agriculture, prosperity, and everyday concerns. Freyr, her brother, embodied fertility and abundance. His blessings mattered greatly in agricultural societies where harvest success could determine survival. Good weather, healthy livestock, productive fields. Such things were never taken for granted. People prayed for them, offered sacrifices for them, hoped divine favor might improve their chances. Then there was Loki, perhaps the most complicated figure in Norse mythology. Modern audiences often know his name, yet popular portrayals rarely capture the full complexity of the original traditions. Loki was not simply evil, nor was he entirely good. He existed somewhere in between. A trickster, a shapeshifter, a source of both solutions and problems. At times he aided the gods. At other times he betrayed them. His actions created chaos. Yet that chaos often drove events forward. Loki represented uncertainty, change, the unpredictable forces that shape existence. No matter how carefully people planned, surprises always remained possible. Loki embodied that reality. The myths themselves formed an interconnected world of stories. Stories passed from generation to generation. Stories recited beside fires during long winter nights. Stories performed by poets. Stories remembered long before they were ever written down. These tales explained everything from thunderstorms to social values. They entertained. They educated. They preserved cultural memory. Yet among all Norse myths, one stood above the rest in its emotional power. The story of Ragnarok, the end of the world. Many religions promise ultimate victory, eternal peace, final triumph. Norse mythology offered something very different. The gods knew they were doomed. They understood that a final catastrophe awaited. One day the world would descend into chaos. Great winters would come. Wars would spread. Moral order would collapse. Ancient enemies would break free. Monsters would rise. And the gods themselves would march toward a battle they could not win. Odin would die. Thor would die. Many of the greatest gods would fall. The universe would burn. The world would sink beneath the waters. It is difficult to overstate how unusual this idea is. The central figures of the religion were not immortal victors. They were doomed heroes. They fought despite knowing defeat awaited them. And perhaps that is why the story resonated so deeply. Four Vikings living in a dangerous world. Courage mattered most when success was uncertain. Anyone can be brave when victory is guaranteed. True courage emerges when outcomes remain doubtful. Ragnarok taught that honor existed not in avoiding defeat, but in facing it with dignity. Even more remarkable, Ragnarok was not truly the end. After destruction came renewal. The world would rise again. Green, fertile, renewed. Some gods would survive. Human beings would survive. Life would continue. The cycle would begin again. This blend of tragedy and hope reveals much about the Norse worldview. Nothing lasted forever. Not kingdoms. Not heroes. Not even gods. Yet endings created beginnings. Destruction created opportunities for renewal. The old made way for the new. Religious practice extended beyond myths. It shaped daily life. Sacrifices formed an important part of worship. Animals were offered to the gods. Feasts followed. Communities gathered together. Shared meals strengthened social bonds. Religious ceremonies reinforced collective identity. Participation mattered. These were not private beliefs isolated within individual minds. They were community experiences, public expressions of shared values. Sacred spaces existed throughout the landscape. Some worship occurred in buildings. Others occurred outdoors. Groves, springs, hilltops, natural locations often carried spiritual significance. The boundary between religion and daily life remained blurred. The sacred existed everywhere. Magic also occupied an important place within Norse belief. People sought knowledge of the future, protection from danger, influence over events. Various practices promised access to hidden forces. Among the most famous was Seeder, a form of magic associated particularly with prophecy and fate. Practitioners claimed abilities to glimpse possibilities beyond ordinary perception. Whether people truly believed such powers existed is difficult to measure. But the practices clearly mattered. They fulfilled emotional and cultural needs. Runes added another layer of mystery. Today, many people recognize runic symbols. Yet runes were more than an alphabet. Many Vikings believed they possessed deeper significance. Certain inscriptions might offer protection, bring luck, mark important events, or honor the dead. Words themselves carried power. Writing carried power. Symbols carried power. Perhaps the most important concept in Viking belief was fate. The idea that destinies existed beyond human control. According to myth, supernatural beings known as the Norns shaped the fates of all living things. Even gods could not escape what had been woven for them. This belief created an interesting tension. If fate could not be changed, why strive? Why fight? Why take risks? The Viking answer appears clear. Because while fate determined outcomes, individuals still controlled how they responded. A person might not choose death, but they could choose courage. A person might not choose hardship, but they could choose honor. Character mattered. Response mattered. The manner in which one faced fate mattered. This philosophy influenced Viking culture profoundly. It appears repeatedly in literature, in poetry, in historical accounts. It shaped ideas about leadership, reputation, and personal responsibility. Yet even as the old gods remained powerful in Scandinavian imagination, change approached, slowly, at first almost unnoticed. Christian traders arrived. Christian captives arrived. Christian missionaries arrived. New ideas entered the north. Most Scandinavians initially saw little reason to abandon traditional beliefs. Why reject gods who had guided their ancestors for generations? Why exchange familiar traditions for foreign teachings? For a long time, many simply added Christianity to existing practices. Some wore Thor's hammer and a Christian cross. At the same time, there was no urgency to choose, no immediate conflict. Yet over the coming centuries, the arrival of Christianity would transform Scandinavia completely. Kings would convert, churches would rise, old traditions would fade. The Viking world would change forever. But before that transformation fully unfolded, Scandinavia itself was changing in other ways. Because while stories of gods filled the imagination, most Vikings spent their days focused on far more practical concerns. Planting crops, building homes, raising children, preparing for winter, trading goods, resolving disputes, living ordinary lives. And if we want to understand the real Vikings, not merely the warriors or the legends, we must step inside their homes, walk through their settlements, sit beside their fires, and discover what daily life actually looked like for the people who built the Viking world. When most people hear the word Viking, a particular image usually appears in their minds. Warriors standing at the front of long ships, axes raised, shields gleaming, the sea stretching endlessly behind them. It is a powerful image, and it is not entirely wrong, but is incomplete, because the vast majority of people who lived during the Viking Age never spent their lives raiding distant shores. Most never became famous. Most never appeared in sagas. Most never commanded armies. They were farmers, fishers, craftsmen, mothers, fathers, children, people concerned with the same fundamental questions that have occupied humanity throughout history. How we find food. How do we protect our families? How do we survive the winter? How do we create a better future for our children? To understand the Viking world, we must leave the battlefield for a while. We must enter the longhouse. The longhouse stood at the center of everyday life. It was far more than a building. It was the heart of the household, a place where people worked, ate, slept, talked, celebrated, and endured hardship together. From the outside, many longhouses appeared simple. Wooden walls, a roof covered with thatch or turf, smoke rising into the northern sky. Yet appearances could be deceptive. Inside these structures, entire worlds existed. Some longhouses stretched for impressive distances, especially those belonging to wealthy families. Others were smaller, more modest, but regardless of size, they served similar functions. The central hearth provided warmth. Cooking took place there. Light came from the fire. Stories were told around it. Decisions were made beside it. During the long northern winters, the hearth became the center of existence. Outside, darkness and cold dominated. Inside, life continued. Smoke filled the air. The scent of cooking lingered constantly. People shared space with one another in ways that would feel unusual today. Privacy was limited. Daily life unfolded in full view of family members. Everyone knew everyone else's habits. Everyone participated in the work required for survival. The rhythm of life followed the seasons. Spring brought urgency. Fields had to be prepared. Animals required attention. Every available hour mattered. A delay could reduce harvests months later. Summer offered opportunities. Crops grew. Fishing intensified. Travel became easier. Repairs could be completed. Trade expeditions often departed during favorable weather. Autumn created another burst of activity. Harvests had to be gathered. Food had to be preserved. Livestock decisions had to be made. Communities raced against time. Winter was coming, and winter demanded preparation. Then winter arrived. Long nights, cold winds, frozen landscapes. The outside world became more hostile. Life contracted inward. Families spent more time together. Craft work increased. Stories flourished. The darkness encouraged reflection, memory, and tradition. Food remained a constant concern. Modern supermarkets have distanced many people from the realities of food production. Vikings possessed no such luxury. Every meal represented effort, planning, labor, and often uncertainty. Grain formed the foundation of many diets. Barley was particularly important. Oats also played a significant role. These crops provided flexibility. They could be turned into bread, porridge, ale, and various other foods. Porridge may not sound exciting, yet it sustained countless generations. Reliable, nutritious, adaptable. It appeared on tables throughout Scandinavia. Fish served as another essential resource, especially in coastal regions. The sea provided abundance. Cod, herring, salmon, and many other species contributed to survival. Fishing knowledge passed from generation to generation. Techniques improved through experience. Entire communities depended on maritime resources. Preservation methods became crucial. Fresh fish spoiled quickly. Dried fish lasted far longer. Smoked fish lasted far longer. Learning how to preserve food often determined whether families survived difficult periods. Meat occupied an interesting place within Viking diets. Animals possessed value beyond simple consumption. A living cow produced milk. A living sheep produced wool. A living animal represented future possibilities. As a result, many families consumed meat less frequently than modern audiences might assume. When animals were slaughtered, every part was used. Waste was unacceptable. The margin between survival and hardship remained too narrow. Dairy products became extremely important. Milk, butter, cheese, skyr. These foods provided nutrients throughout the year. Some could be stored for long periods. Others supported communities during seasons when fresh resources became scarce. Wild foods supplemented agricultural production. Berries were gathered. Mushrooms were collected. Nuts were harvested. Knowledge of local environments mattered greatly. People understood where resources could be found, when they became available, and how to use them safely. Ale occupied an important social role. Water quality could be unreliable. Ale often provided a safer alternative. It also became central to gatherings, celebrations, feasts, political negotiations, hospitality. Sharing drink strengthened relationships. Refusing hospitality could create tension. Accepting it reinforced social bonds. Clothing reflected both practicality and identity. The northern climate demanded warmth. Wool became indispensable. Linen also appeared frequently. Producing fabric required enormous effort. Before industrial technology, every stage demanded human labor. Fibers had to be prepared. Thread had to be spun. Cloth had to be woven. Garments had to be sewn. The process consumed countless hours. As a result, clothing carried significant value. A well-made garment represented wealth, skill, and time invested. Women played a central role in textile production. Their work supported entire households. Without cloth, there were no sails, no warm clothing, no blankets, no many of the items essential to daily life. Textile work often receives less attention than warfare in popular accounts. Yet, Viking expansion itself depended upon it. Even the famous longships required sails, and sails required vast quantities of woven fabric. Jewelry occupied an important place in Viking society, not merely for decoration, but as a display of status, a form of portable wealth. Silver arm rings, brooches, necklaces, rings. These objects communicated information. They signaled prosperity, connections, success. Some could be cut into pieces and used in trade. Beauty and practicality often existed together. Children grew up quickly in the Viking world. Life expectancy was uncertain. Work began early. Young people learned through participation. Boys and girls observed adults constantly. Skills passed directly between generations. There were no formal schools in the modern sense. Education occurred through experience. Storytelling, observation, and practice. A child learned by doing. Farming, fishing, craft production, household management. Every skill mattered. Yet childhood was not devoid of joy. Archaeologists have discovered toys, game pieces, miniature objects, evidence that children played, imagined, and enjoyed themselves. Human nature remains remarkably consistent across centuries. Parents loved their children. Children sought amusement. Families celebrated milestones. These realities connected Vikings to every other human society. Games entertained both adults and children. Board games proved especially popular. One famous example involved strategic movement and planning. Players attempted to protect or capture a central king piece. The game required thought, patience, and tactical awareness. Many historians suspect such games appealed strongly to a culture that valued strategy and leadership. Physical competitions also flourished. Wrestling, swimming, running, tests of strength and endurance. Communities admired athletic ability. Success brought admiration. Failure brought lessons. Life itself often functioned as a competition against nature. Strength carried practical value. Law occupied a surprisingly important role in Viking society. Popular imagination sometimes portrays Vikings as living in constant chaos. The reality was far more organized. Communities depended upon legal systems. Disputes required resolution. Property required protection. Violence required regulation. One of the most remarkable institutions was the Thing, an assembly where free men gathered. Issues were discussed. Laws were recited. Conflicts were addressed. Decisions were made. These gatherings served political, legal, and social functions simultaneously. In many ways, they formed the backbone of local governance. The law speaker occupied a particularly important role. Before widespread literacy, laws existed primarily in memory. Someone had to remember them, recite them, preserve them. The law speaker carried this responsibility. An astonishing amount of information depended upon human memory. Disputes often centered around compensation. If someone suffered injury, payments might settle the matter. If someone was killed, compensation could potentially prevent cycles of revenge. These systems were imperfect. Feuds still occurred. Violence still erupted. Yet the existence of legal mechanisms reveals a society actively attempting to manage conflict. Honor and law interacted constantly. A person's reputation influenced outcomes. Trust mattered. Witnesses mattered. Relationships mattered. Social networks shaped justice. Women occupied a more complex position than many people expect. Viking society remained patriarchal. Men held most formal political power. Yet women possessed rights unavailable in many contemporary societies. They could own property, manage households, request divorce under certain circumstances, exercise economic influence. The household itself often depended upon female leadership. When men traveled, women managed farms, supervised resources, made critical decisions. Their responsibilities were extensive. The keys carried by many household women symbolized authority, control over storage, resources, and domestic management. Some women became highly respected figures, known for wisdom, influence, or strong personalities. Saga literature preserves numerous examples. Not passive figures standing at the margins, but active participants shaping events. That said, Viking society was not egalitarian. Opportunities varied. Expectations differed. Power remained unevenly distributed. Understanding this complexity is important. The reality sits between modern myths and historical stereotypes. Not everyone enjoyed freedom. Slavery existed throughout the Viking world. Thralls performed labor, served households, worked fields, and possessed few legal protections. Some had been captured during raids. Others inherited slave status through birth. Still others entered slavery through debt or misfortune. The institution generated wealth, supported economic systems, and caused immense suffering. No honest understanding of Viking society can ignore this reality. The slave trade connected Scandinavia to broader networks stretching across Europe and beyond. Human beings became commodities. Bought, sold, transported, exploited. It remains one of the darkest aspects of the Viking Age. Yet despite hardship, despite inequality, despite violence, communities endured. People built lives, raised families, created traditions, found moments of happiness. The Viking world was not defined solely by raids or warfare. Most days involved ordinary activities, cooking meals, repairing tools, talking with neighbors, caring for animals, watching children grow. These experiences formed the foundation upon which everything else rested. And as generations passed, Some Vikings began looking beyond Scandinavia entirely, not merely for raids, not merely for trade, but for new homes, new opportunities, new societies. Far out in the North Atlantic lay a land few people knew, a volcanic island of glaciers, mountains, hot springs, and enormous possibilities, a place that would become one of the most extraordinary chapters in Viking history. A place called Iceland. For centuries, the northern Atlantic Ocean had seemed like a boundary, a cold and dangerous expanse stretching beyond the familiar horizons of Europe. Storms dominated its waters. Fog concealed its dangers. Powerful currents challenged even experienced sailors. Most people looked west and saw uncertainty. The Vikings looked west and saw possibility. That difference changed history. By the 9th century, Scandinavian sailors had already become some of the most skilled navigators in the world. They understood winds, currents, cloud formation, bird migrations, the behavior of the sea itself. Knowledge accumulated through generations of experience, passed from sailor to sailor, father to son, crew to crew. Every voyage added new information. Every successful crossing expanded what seemed possible. Somewhere in that growing network of knowledge lay rumors of a distant island. A large island, remote, empty, waiting. The first people known to have reached Iceland were probably Irish monks, seeking solitude, seeking isolation, seeking a place where prayer could occur far from worldly distractions. Small groups may have lived there briefly, leaving little trace behind. When Scandinavian settlers eventually arrived, they found no significant permanent population. From their perspective, Iceland represented something extraordinarily rare, a land where they could start over, a blank page, an opportunity to build entirely new communities. The traditional story begins with a man remembered as Ingolfur Arnarsson, according to later Icelandic accounts. Ingolfur left Norway and sailed westward in search of a new life. As he approached the island, he performed a symbolic act. He threw the carved pillars from his high seat into the sea. He declared that he would settle wherever the waves carried them ashore. Whether the story happened exactly as described is impossible to know, but its survival reveals something important. The settlers wanted their origins connected to fate, to destiny, to the idea that their new homeland had been chosen rather than merely discovered. Eventually, the pillars were found along a southwestern bay. There, Ingolfur established a settlement. The location would later become Reykjavik, today the capital of Iceland. At the time, simply another frontier community at the edge of the known world. Once settlement began, it accelerated rapidly. Word spread throughout Scandinavia. Opportunities existed in the West. Land existed in the West. Freedom existed in the West. And many people found those possibilities attractive. Some settlers sought adventure. Others sought independence. Many sought escape. Norway itself was changing. Powerful kings were consolidating authority. Traditional local leaders faced increasing pressure. Not everyone welcomed centralized rule. Some preferred exile to submission. Rather than live under rulers they disliked, they packed their belongings, gathered their families, loaded ships, and sailed into the Atlantic. The migration transformed Iceland with remarkable speed. Within only a few generations, much of the habitable land had been claimed. Farmsteads appeared throughout coastal regions and valleys. Communities formed. Relationships developed. Conflicts emerged. A new society was taking shape. Yet life in Iceland demanded adaptation. The island offered opportunities, but also presented formidable challenges. The landscape differed dramatically from most of Scandinavia. Volcanoes dominated the interior. Glaciers covered vast regions. Earthquakes occurred. Hot springs erupted from the ground. The environment felt raw, powerful, untamed. Forests existed, but were limited. Many settlers quickly discovered that resources could disappear faster than expected. Wood became precious. Construction methods evolved. People adapted using turf, stone, and whatever materials the environment provided. The growing season remained short. Agriculture required careful planning. Livestock became central to survival. Sheep proved especially valuable. Hardy, adaptable, capable of surviving conditions that challenged other animals. Wool from sheep supported clothing production. Their meat provided food. Their presence became deeply woven into Icelandic life. Fishing also played a critical role. The surrounding waters contained extraordinary resources. Generations of Icelanders developed expertise in exploiting them. Fish supported communities, created trade opportunities, and helped sustain life in a demanding environment. What makes Iceland particularly fascinating is not merely that Vikings settled there. It is what they built afterward. Most medieval societies developed under kings. Monarchs claimed authority. Governments centered around royal power. Iceland followed a different path. Many settlers had left Norway specifically because they disliked increasing royal control. They had no desire to recreate the system they abandoned. Instead, they experimented with something unusual, a society without a king. Local leaders existed. Powerful families existed. Influence certainly existed, but no single monarch ruled Iceland. Governance emerged through assemblies and legal structures. At the center of this system stood the Althing, established around the year 930. The Althing became one of the most remarkable institutions of the medieval world. Every year, representatives gathered at Thingvellir, a dramatic location where geological forces had literally split the earth apart. There among lava fields and cliffs, Icelanders debated laws, resolved disputes, formed alliances, conducted business, and shaped the future of their society. The setting itself seemed almost symbolic. Human order emerging amid powerful natural forces. The Althing served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was a parliament, a court, a marketplace, a social gathering. People traveled from across the island to attend. News spread there. Marriages were arranged there. Conflicts were addressed there. For a few weeks each year, much of Iceland came together. The law speaker held extraordinary importance. Because laws remained largely oral, someone needed to remember them. All of them. The law speaker recited sections each year, preserving collective knowledge through memory. The achievement remains astonishing. Entire legal systems surviving through human recollection, without written codes, without printed books, without modern records. Memory itself became infrastructure. Of course, Iceland was not a utopia. Power struggles occurred. Feuds erupted. Violence remained part of life. Influential families competed fiercely. The famous Icelandic sagas preserve many of these stories. Accounts of disputes, revenge, honor, ambition, and tragedy. Yet despite these challenges, the system endured for centuries. An extraordinary accomplishment in a remote and demanding environment. Iceland also became one of the most important cultural centers of the Norse world. This outcome might seem surprising. After all, it was isolated, distant, sparsely populated. Yet isolation can sometimes preserve traditions, and Iceland preserved them remarkably well. Storytelling flourished, poetry flourished, memory flourished. Generations passed down tales of ancestors, heroes, kings, explorers, and gods. Eventually, many of these stories would be written down. Without Icelandic writers, much of what we know about Norse mythology might have vanished forever. The sagas remain among the greatest literary achievements of the medieval world. They tell stories with striking realism, complex characters, subtle humor, and deep psychological insight. Reading them today often feels surprisingly modern. Their creators understood human nature, They understood pride, jealousy, love, fear, ambition, and the consequences of choice. The people who produced these works lived far from Europe's major centers of power. Yet they created literature that continues to fascinate readers centuries later. As Iceland matured, another challenge emerged. Religion. Christianity had been spreading steadily across the Viking world. Kings converted, missionaries traveled, new ideas circulated. Iceland eventually found itself divided. Some people embraced Christianity. Others remained committed to traditional beliefs. Tensions grew. The possibility of conflict loomed. Many societies facing such divisions descended into violence. Iceland chose another path. The issue came before the Althing. Debate followed. Arguments continued. The future remained uncertain. Finally, the law speaker was asked to decide. According to tradition, he spent a day and night in contemplation, lying beneath a cloak, thinking, reflecting, considering the consequences. When he emerged, he delivered a compromise. Iceland would become officially Christian, but private observance of old customs would temporarily remain tolerated. The decision prevented civil war. The society accepted it, and Christianity gradually spread throughout the island. The episode reveals something remarkable about Icelandic culture: a willingness to prioritize social stability over ideological victory, a practical solution to a potentially explosive problem. As the years passed, Christianity became dominant. Churches appeared. New traditions emerged. Connections with Christian Europe strengthened. Yet memories of the old belief survived, preserved in stories, preserved in literature, preserved in cultural memory. Iceland remained independent for centuries. Its language changed more slowly than many other Scandinavian languages. Its traditions endured. Its people maintained connections to both their Viking heritage and their Christian future. Yet perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of Iceland's story lies in what happened next. Because for some settlers, Iceland itself was not the final destination. Even at the edge of the known world, some individuals kept looking farther west, beyond the horizon, beyond certainty, beyond maps. One of those individuals was a fiery and controversial man named Eric the Red. His actions would lead to the discovery of Greenland, and his son would eventually sail even farther, toward a land no European civilization had ever permanently reached before. A land across the Atlantic, a land that modern history knows as North America. 5 centuries before Columbus, the Vikings were about to push exploration farther than anyone in Europe could imagine. History often remembers great discoveries as moments of triumph. A ship appears on a distant horizon. A new land emerges from a mist. A flag is planted. A chapter begins. The reality is usually far messier. Discoveries often grow out of accidents, arguments, failures, unexpected turns of fate. The Viking discovery of Greenland began with exactly that kind of story. At the center stood a man whose nickname has survived for more than 1,000 years. Eric the Red. Even among the Vikings, a people not known for avoiding conflict, Eric developed a reputation for violence. The reasons behind his exile from Iceland involved disputes that escalated into killings. The details vary across sources, but the outcome is clear. He was declared an outlaw. For a period of years, he would have no legal protection, no guaranteed place within Icelandic society. For many people, such a sentence would have marked disaster. For Eric, it became an opportunity. Rather than remain idle, he turned west. Rumors already existed. Stories circulated about land beyond Iceland. Some sailors claimed to have glimpsed distant coastlines. Others reported strange sightings across the sea. Nobody knew exactly what lay there, but Eric intended to find out. The journey demanded courage. The North Atlantic was unforgiving. Even experienced sailors respected its dangers. Storms appeared suddenly. Ice threatened ships. Navigation errors carried enormous consequences. Yet Eric sailed onward. What he discovered was one of the largest islands on Earth. A place of immense glaciers, towering mountains, deep fjords, and harsh beauty. Today we call it Greenland. The name itself remains one of history's most successful marketing decisions, because Greenland is not especially green, at least not in the way many people imagine. Yet along parts of the southwestern coast, particularly during warmer periods, patches of grassland existed. Livestock could graze. Farming seemed possible. Life seemed possible. When Eric returned to Iceland, he began promoting the new land enthusiastically. The medieval sources suggest he deliberately chose the name Greenland because attractive names attract settlers. Whether entirely true or partly legend, the strategy worked. People listened. Families considered the possibilities. Land ownership in Iceland had become increasingly difficult. The best areas were already claimed. Opportunities seemed limited. Greenland offered a fresh start, a second frontier. Around 985 or 986, a fleet departed Iceland carrying settlers. Men, women, children, livestock, supplies, everything necessary to build new communities. The crossing was dangerous. Not every ship arrived. Some disappeared, others turned back, but enough completed the voyage, and the settlement of Greenland began. The newcomers established farms along the southwestern coast. Two major settlement regions emerged, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. Despite their names, both occupied the more hospitable southwestern portion of the island. There, among fjords carved by ancient ice, Norse communities took root. Life was never easy. The environment demanded constant effort. Growing seasons remained short. Resources remained limited. The margin for error remained narrow. Yet the settlers endured. They raised sheep, cattle, goats. They fished, hunted, adapted, and slowly built a society at the edge of the inhabitable world. Churches appeared. Farms expanded. Trade connections linked Greenland to Iceland and Europe. The colony survived. Indeed, it survived far longer than many modern people realize. For nearly 5 centuries, one of Greenland's greatest exports was walrus ivory. Before large-scale access to African elephant ivory became common, walrus tusks commanded significant value. European artisans transformed them into luxury goods. Religious objects, decorative carvings. The trade generated wealth, and wealth helped sustain the settlements. Yet Greenland remained isolated. Every voyage carried risk. Every connection depended on the sea, and the sea could never be trusted completely. Still, the settlers adapted remarkably well. Then came the next great leap, one even more extraordinary than Greenland itself. According to tradition, the story began with another sailor, a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson. Bjarni set out for Greenland, but storms intervened. Weather pushed his ship off course. For days he sailed through unfamiliar waters. Eventually he sighted land. Not Greenland. Something different. Low coastlines. Forested landscapes. A world unlike the icy shores he expected. Bjarni never landed. His goal remained Greenland. So he continued onward. But when he arrived, he told his story, and someone listened very carefully. Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red. Leif possessed the same spirit of exploration that had driven his father westward. Hearing Bjarni's account sparked his curiosity. If land existed farther west, what was it? What resources might it contain? What opportunities awaited? Leif purchased Bjarni's ship, gathered a crew, and set sail. The voyage that followed would make him one of the most significant explorers in human history. Leif moved west across the Atlantic, exploring coastlines unknown to Europeans. The sagas describe several regions. Helgeland, a rocky land often associated with Baffin Island. Markland, a heavily forested region usually linked to Labrador. and finally Vinland, the most famous destination of all. The exact location of Vinland remains debated, but modern evidence strongly suggests it included parts of Newfoundland and perhaps areas farther south. For the Greenlanders, the discoveries were astonishing. Trees covered the landscape. Large trees, useful trees. Greenland suffered from a shortage of timber, what represented one of its most valuable resources. Vinland seemed rich in it. Fish appeared abundant. The climate felt milder. Opportunities seemed endless. Leif and his crew spent time exploring, then returned to Greenland carrying news of their discoveries. The story spread quickly. Excitement followed. Others wanted to see these lands for themselves. Additional expeditions departed. Among them was one led by Leif's brother Thorvald. His voyage ended tragically. According to the sagas, Thorvald became one of the first Europeans known to have died in conflict with indigenous peoples of North America. The encounter reminds us of something important. The lands discovered by the Vikings were not empty. They were home to people, communities with their own histories, their own cultures, their own relationships with the land. The Norse referred to them using a term preserved in the sagas, a word often translated as Skrælings. The exact meaning remains debated, but interactions between Norse explorers and indigenous populations would become a defining factor in the fate of Vinland. Another expedition followed, this one led by Thorfinn Karlsefni, a wealthy and ambitious merchant. Unlike earlier voyages focused primarily on exploration, Karlsefni attempted something more ambitious. He brought families, supplies, livestock, everything required to establish a colony. For a time, the effort appeared promising. Homes were built. Exploration continued. Trade may have occurred. One child born during the expedition became the first known European born in North America. The possibilities seemed real, yet reality soon intervened. The Norse settlers remained few in number. The indigenous populations greatly outnumbered them. Tensions emerged. Conflicts occurred. Trade relationships proved fragile. Misunderstandings carried serious consequences. The Vikings possessed advantages: iron tools, metal weapons, maritime experience. But numbers mattered. Distance mattered. Isolation mattered. Any colony would depend upon support from Greenland, which depended upon support from Iceland, which depended upon support from Europe. The logistical chain stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Maintaining permanent settlement under such conditions proved extraordinarily difficult. Eventually, the settlers abandoned the effort. They returned east. Vinland remained a place of exploration, a place of resources, but not a lasting colony. Yet the achievement itself remained extraordinary. Around the year 1000, Viking sailors crossed the Atlantic and reached North America, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. Centuries before the Great Age of European exploration. They did not merely glimpse the continent. They landed, explored, built structures, and interacted with indigenous peoples. For a long time, many scholars doubted the stories. The sagas seemed too remarkable, too distant, too uncertain. Then archaeology changed everything. In 1960, researchers discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at Lance Aux Meadows in Newfoundland. The evidence proved decisive. Buildings constructed in Scandinavian style. Ironworking remains. Artifacts unmistakably linked to Norse culture. The sagas had preserved genuine history. The Vikings really had reached North America. The discovery transformed historical understanding. What had once seemed legendary became documented fact. Leif Erikson's voyages entered global history not merely as stories, but as verified exploration. Yet, unlike later European colonization, the Norse presence remained brief. No lasting empire emerged. No continuous settlement survived. The Atlantic crossing remained too difficult. The colonies remained too isolated. The rewards never fully outweighed the challenges. In some ways, this makes the story even more fascinating. The Vikings reached the continent. They proved it could be done. And then history moved in another direction. Their discovery became a road not taken, a glimpse of possibilities that never fully unfolded. Meanwhile, Greenland continued struggling for survival. For centuries, the settlements endured. Generations lived and died there. Children grew into adults who knew no other home. Churches stood among the fjords. Farmers tended livestock. Merchants awaited ships from Europe. But slowly conditions changed. Climate shifted. The medieval warm period faded. Temperatures declined. Sea ice expanded. Agriculture became more difficult. Trade became less reliable. The world around the Greenlanders grew harsher. At the same time, economic realities changed. Walrus ivory lost value. Alternative sources became available. European demand weakened. The colony's economic foundation eroded. Isolation deepened. The final chapter of Norse Greenland remains one of history's great mysteries. Records become scarce. Communication fades. Then silence. By the 15th century, the settlements had disappeared. When later Europeans visited Greenland, they found ruins. Empty churches. Abandoned farms. Questions. What happened to the last Greenlanders? Did they starve? Leave voluntarily? Integrate with indigenous communities? Fall victim to disease? The truth remains uncertain. History rarely provides all the answers. Sometimes it leaves only traces. Fragments. Mysteries waiting to be explored. Yet regardless of how Greenland ended, the achievements remain undeniable. The Vikings crossed oceans that many considered impossible. They settled Iceland, colonized Greenland, reached North America, connected distant worlds through courage and skill. Their voyages expanded the boundaries of human knowledge, and they did all of it using wooden ships. Stars, memory, experience, and determination. But while explorers pushed west across the Atlantic, Scandinavia itself was changing. Kings were gaining power. Kingdoms were emerging. The age of scattered chieftains was slowly giving way to something new. And that transformation would eventually bring the Viking Age itself toward its end. By the beginning of the 11th century, the Viking world looked very different from the world that had launched the raid on Lindisfarne more than 200 years earlier. The transformation had been gradual. So gradual that many people living through it may not have noticed it happening. But history was moving. The old order was changing. And the very forces that had helped create the Viking Age were now helping bring it to an end. For generations, Scandinavia had been a land of local chieftains, regional rulers, competing families. Power was often personal. A leader's authority depended on reputation, success, loyalty, and the ability to reward followers. But over time, stronger kings began emerging. Men who wanted more than influence over a single district. Men who wanted kingdoms. In Denmark, rulers worked steadily to unite territories beneath a single crown. Among the most important was Harald Bluetooth, a king whose name survives today in a form he could never have imagined. More than 1,000 years later, wireless technology would borrow his name because it united separate devices just as he helped unite Denmark. In his own lifetime, Harald's achievements were political rather than technological. He consolidated power, strengthened royal authority, and most importantly, embraced Christianity. That decision changed everything. Religion in the medieval world was never simply a matter of private belief. It carried political consequences, economic consequences, diplomatic consequences. A Christian king could build relationships with other Christian rulers. A Christian kingdom could participate more fully in European affairs. Conversion opened doors. Harald understood this. So did other Scandinavian rulers. The process was not always peaceful. Some communities resisted. Some leaders resisted. The old gods still held deep emotional power. Traditional beliefs remained woven into everyday life. Yet the momentum increasingly favored Christianity. Churches appeared. Missionaries traveled. Kings supported conversion. The world of Odin and Thor slowly gave way to the world of bishops and saints. In Norway, the process often unfolded through conflict. Kings such as Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson pushed Christianity aggressively, sometimes through persuasion, sometimes through force. Resistance existed, yet over time, the new faith spread. Generations grew up in a different religious environment. Children learned Christian prayers instead of traditional rituals. New values entered society. New institutions emerged. Sweden converted more slowly. The old beliefs survived there longer than in neighboring regions. Sacred sites remained active. Traditional practices persisted. But eventually the same transformation occurred. By the 12th century, Scandinavia had become overwhelmingly Christian. The old religion did not vanish completely. Echoes survived in folklore. Stories, customs, place names, memory, but it no longer shaped public life as it once had. Political power continued centralizing. Kings expanded their authority. Royal administrations grew more sophisticated. Written records became increasingly important. Church officials brought literacy. Law codes were written down. Governance became more organized. The world of independent Viking chieftains gradually faded. At the same time, the targets that had once seemed vulnerable were changing too. England adapted. Frankish territories adapted. European rulers learned from experience. Defenses improved. Fortifications multiplied. Military responses became more effective. The easy opportunities that had fueled early Viking expansion became harder to find. Raiding no longer offered the same rewards. Trade often proved more profitable. Administration often proved more profitable. Governance often proved more profitable. The incentives shifted, and societies shifted with them. One figure stands at the center of this later Viking world. Nut the Great, a ruler whose career demonstrated how much had changed. Nut was the son of Sweyn Forkbeard, a Danish king who conquered England. Building on those achievements, Nut created a vast North Sea empire. He ruled England, Denmark, Norway, and exercised influence beyond them. Yet Nut did not rule as an old-style Viking raider. He ruled as a medieval monarch. He issued laws, worked with church leaders, managed administration, participated in European politics. He represented something new. The descendants of Vikings had become kings of established states. The transformation was complete. The world that produced the first raiders was disappearing. Then came the year 1066, one of the most famous years in European history, a year often associated with the end of the Viking Age. The story began with a succession crisis in England. Competing claims emerged. Ambitious rulers saw opportunity. Among them stood Harald Hardrada of Norway, a remarkable figure, warrior, king, veteran of campaigns stretching from Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire. Many historians consider him the last great Viking king. Hardrada believed he possessed a legitimate claim to the English throne, so he gathered an army, crossed the sea, and invaded England. The campaign began successfully. Victories were won. Momentum seemed favorable, yet events moved quickly. The English king Harold Godwin's son marched north with astonishing speed. The two forces met at Stamford Bridge. The battle proved decisive. Hardrada was killed. His invasion collapsed. Many historians regard that moment as the symbolic end of the Viking Age. Yet history offered one final twist. Only days after Stamford Bridge, another invasion began, this time from the south. William of Normandy crossed the English Channel. William's ancestors had been Vikings. Centuries earlier, a Viking leader named Rollo had received lands in northern France. Those lands became Normandy. Over generations, the descendants of those settlers adopted French language, French customs, Christian identity, yet their origins remained Scandinavian. In a sense, Vikings returned to England one last time, not as pagan raiders, not as longship warriors, but as medieval nobles. At the Battle of Hastings, William defeated Harold Godwin's son. England entered a new era, and with that transformation, the Viking Age faded into history. Not because Vikings disappeared overnight, not because Scandinavian people changed instantly, but because the conditions that had created the age no longer existed. The world had moved on. Scandinavia became part of medieval Europe. Kings ruled kingdoms. Churches dominated religious life. Trade expanded. Cities grew. New political systems emerged. The age of dragon-proud raids belonged to the past. Yet the Vikings left behind far more than stories of warfare. Their legacy reached across continents, across cultures, across centuries. The cities they founded continued growing. Dublin survived. York survived. Many settlements established during the Viking Age became important centers of later history. Languages carried their influence. Modern English contains hundreds of words inherited from Old Norse. Words used every day, often without anyone realizing their origins. Sky, window, knife, egg, leg, husband, law, and many others. The Viking contribution became woven into the language itself. Place names preserve memory. Across Britain, Ireland, Scotland, and beyond, the landscape still carries traces of Scandinavian settlement. Names that began more than 1,000 years ago continue appearing on maps. Genetics tell a similar story. Modern DNA research reveals Scandinavian ancestry across vast regions. The descendants of Viking settlers remain part of the populations they helped shape. The influence never vanished. It simply became part of the human story. Their artistic achievements endured. Intricate metalwork, wood carving, runestones, poetry, the sagas. These creations survived long after the warriors who inspired them had disappeared. Perhaps nowhere is this clearer than in Iceland. There, medieval writers preserved stories that might otherwise have been lost forever. Because of them, we know the names of gods, heroes, explorers, kings. Without their efforts, much of Norse culture would have faded into silence. The Vikings also changed how humans understood geography. They connected distant regions, linked trade networks, expanded horizons. Their ships traveled from North America to the Middle East, from Arctic waters to the Mediterranean world. They crossed oceans many people feared, explored rivers stretching deep into unknown territories, and proved that seemingly impossible journeys could be achieved. Yet their legacy is not entirely admirable. The same people who explored also enslaved. The same people who traded also raided. The same people who created beautiful art also committed terrible acts of violence. History rarely offers simple heroes or simple villains. The Vikings were neither. They were human beings, complex, contradictory, capable of remarkable achievements and profound cruelty. Like every civilization, like every age, their story matters because it reminds us that people are rarely one thing. The Vikings were explorers and conquerors, artists and warriors, poets and merchants, settlers and raiders. Their lives contained multitudes. For centuries, their image shifted. Medieval writers often portrayed them as terrifying pagans. Later generations romanticized them into larger-than-life heroes. Modern scholarship has revealed something more interesting than either extreme. The real Vikings, people shaped by their environment, their opportunities, their fears, their ambitions. People trying to build lives in a difficult world. People who changed history while pursuing goals that often seemed immediate and practical. As we look back across more than 1,000 years, the Viking Age feels both distant and strangely familiar. The longships are gone. The great halls have vanished. The kings and warriors have become names in books. Yet the questions they faced remain recognizable. How far should we go in search of opportunity? How do societies respond to change? What happens when cultures meet? How should people balance tradition and innovation? How do ordinary individuals shape history without realizing it? The Vikings never knew they were living through an age that future generations would study. They did not think of themselves as historical figures. They simply lived, worked, fought, loved, traveled, dreamed, raised families, and tried to leave something behind. In that sense, they were no different from us. And perhaps that is why their story continues to resonate. Because beneath the armor, beneath the myths, beneath the legends, we find people, real people, standing on cold northern shores, looking out across unknown waters, wondering what might exist beyond the horizon, then finding the courage to sail toward it. And in doing so, changing the world forever. The Viking Age ended, but its echoes still remain. In languages, in cities, in stories, in memory, and in the enduring human desire to explore what lies beyond the edge of the known world. The longships have disappeared into history. The northern seas continue rolling beneath the same skies. And the saga of the Vikings, one of the most remarkable chapters in human history, continues to be told.